Chapter 9 The Reformation of Kid McCoy. Miss McCoy of Texas had been subjected to the softening influences of St. Ursula's school for 3 years without any perceptible result. She was the toughest little tomboy that was ever received and retained in a respectable boarding school. Marguerite was the name her parents had chosen when the itinerant bishop made his quarterly visit to the mining camp where she happened to be born. It was the name still used by her teachers and on the written reports that were mailed monthly to her Texas guardian, but Kid was the more appropriate name that the cowboys on the ranch had given her, and Kid she remained at St. Ursula's in spite of the distressed expostulation of the ladies in charge. Kid's childhood had been picturesque to a degree rarely found outside the pages of a Nick Carter novel. She had possessed an adventurous father who drifted from mining camp to mining camp, making fortunes and losing them. She had cut her teeth on a poker chip and drunk her milk from a champagne glass. Her father had died, quite opportunely, while his latest fortune was at its height, and had left his little daughter to the guardianship of an English friend who lived in Texas. The next 3 turbulent years of her life were spent on a cattle range with Guardy, and the ensuing 3, the quiet confines of St. Ursula's. The guardian had brought her himself, and after an earnest conference with the dowager, had left her behind to be molded by the culture of the East. But so far, the culture of the East had left her untouched. If any molding had taken place, it was Kid herself who shaped the clay. Her spicy reminiscences of mining camps and cattle ranches made all permissible works of fiction tame. She had given the French dancing master, who was teaching them a polite version of a Spanish waltz, an exposition of the real thing as practiced by the Mexican cowpunchers on her guardian's ranch. It was a performance that left him sympathetically breathless. The English riding master, who came weekly in the spring and autumn to teach the girls a correct trot, had received a lesson in bareback riding that caused the dazed query, "Was the young lady trained in a circus?" The Kid was noisy and slangy and romping and boisterous. Her way was beset with reproofs and demerits and minor punishments, but she had never yet been guilty of any actual felony. For 3 years, however, St. Ursula's had been holding its breath waiting for the crash. Miss McCoy, from her very nature, was bound to give them a sensation sometime. When at last it came, it was of an entirely unexpected order. Rosalie Patton was the Kid's latest roommate. She wore her roommates out as fast as she did her shoes. Rosalie was a lovable little soul, the essence of everything feminine. The dowager had put the 2 together in the hope that Rosalie's gentle example might calm the Kid's tempestuous mood. But so far, the Kid was in her usual spirits, while Rosalie was looking worn. Then the change came. Rosalie burst into Patty Wyatt's room one evening in a state of wide-eyed amazement. "What do you think?" she cried. "Kid McCoy says she's going to be a lady." "A what?" Patty emerged from the bath towel with which she had been polishing her face. "A lady. She's sitting down now, running pale blue baby ribbon through the embroidery in her nightgown." "What's happened to her?" was Patty's question. "She's been reading a book that May Mertelle brought back." Rosalie settled herself Turk fashion on the window seat, disposed the fold of her pink kimono in graceful billows about her knees, and allowed 2 braids of curly yellow hair to hang picturesquely over her shoulders. She was ready for bed, and could extend her call until the last stroke of the lights-out bell. "What kind of a book?" asked Patty, with a slightly perfunctory note in her voice. Rosalie was apt to burst into one's room with a startling announcement, and then, having engaged everybody's attention, settle down to an endless, meandering recital sprinkled with anticlimaxes. "It's about a sweet young English girl whose father owned a tea estate in Asia, or maybe Africa. But anyway where it was hot, and there were a lot of natives and snakes and centipedes. Her mother died and she was sent back home to boarding school when she was a tiny little thing. Her father was quite bad. He drank and swore and smoked. The only thing that kept him from being awfully bad was the thought of his sweet little golden-haired daughter in England. "Well, what of it?" Patty inquired, politely suppressing a yawn. Rosalie had a way of trailing off into golden-haired sentiment if one didn't holler up sharp. "Just wait, I'm coming to it. When she was 17, she went back to India to take care of her father, but almost right off he got a sunstroke and died. And in his deathbed he entrusted Rosamond, that was her name, to his best friend to finish bringing up. So when Rosamond went to live with her guardian, and took charge of his bungalow and made it beautiful and homelike and comfortable, she wouldn't let him drink or smoke or swear any more. And as he looked back over the past, he was eaten with remorse at the thought of the wasted years," Patty glibly supplied, "and wished that he had lived so as to be more worthy of the sweet womanly influence that had come into his wicked life." "You've read it!" said Rosalie. "Not that I know of," said Patty. "Anyway," said Rosalie with an air of challenge, "they fell in love and were married. And her father and mother, looking down from heaven, smiled a blessing on the dear little daughter who had brought so much happiness to a lonely heart." Yes," agreed Rosalie doubtfully. There was no amount of sentiment that she would not swallow, but she knew from mortifying experience that Patty was not equally voracious. "It's a very touching story," Patty commented, "but where does Kid McCoy come in?" "Why, don't you see?" Rosalie's violet eyes were big with interest. "It's exactly Kid's own story. I realized it the minute I saw the book, and I had the awfullest time making her read it. She made fun of it at first, but after she'd really got into it, she appreciated the resemblance. She says now it was the hand of fate." "Kid's story? What are you talking about?" Patty was commencing to be interested. "Kid has a wicked English guardian just like the Rosamond in the book. Anyway, he's English, and she thinks probably he's wicked. Most ranchmen are. He lives all alone with only cow-punchers for companions, and he needs a sweet womanly influence in his home. So Kid's decided to be a lady and go back and marry Guardy and make him happy for the rest of his life." Patty laid herself on the bed and rolled in glee. Rosalie rose and regarded her with a touch of asperity. "I don't see anything so funny. I think it's very romantic." "Kid exerting a sweet womanly influence?" Patty gurgled. "She can't even pretend she's a lady for an hour. If you think she can stay one—" "Love," pronounced Rosalie, "has accomplished greater wonders than that. You wait and see." And the school did see. Kid McCoy's reformation became the sensation of the year. The teachers attributed the felicitous change in her deportment to the good influence of Rosalie, and though they were extremely relieved, they did not expect it to last. But week followed week, and it did last. Kid McCoy no longer answered to Kid. She requested her friends to call her Marguerite. She dropped slang and learned to embroider. She sat through European travel and art history nights with clasped hands and a sweetly pensive air, where she used to drive her neighbors wild by a solid hour of squirming. Voluntarily, she set herself to practicing scales. The reason she confided to Rosalie, and Rosalie to the rest of the school. They needed the softening influence of music on the ranch. One-Eyed Joe played the accordion, and that was all the music they had. The school saw visions of a transformed Marguerite, dressed in white, sitting before the piano in the twilight, singing softly the Rosary, while Guardy watched her with folded arms, and the cowboys, with bowie knives sheathed in their boots, and lariats peacefully coiled over their shoulders, gathered by the open window. Lenten services that year, instead of being forcibly endured by a rebellious Kid, were attended by a sweetly reverent Marguerite. The entire school felt an electric thrill at sight of Miss McCoy walking up the aisle with downcast eyes and hands demurely clasping her prayer book. Usually she looked as much in place in the stained-glass atmosphere of Trinity Chapel as an unbroken bronco colt. This amazing reform continued for 7 weeks. The school was almost beginning to forget that there was ever a time when Kid McCoy was not a lady. Then one day a letter came from Guardy with the news that he was coming east to visit his little girl. Subdued excitement prevailed in the south corridor. Rosalie and Marguerite and an assemblage of neighbors held earnest conferences as to what she should wear and how she should behave. They finally decided upon a white muslin and blue ribbons. They pondered a long time over whether or not she should kiss him, but Rosalie decided in the negative. "When he sees you," she explained, "the realization will sweep over him that you are no longer a child. You have grown to womanhood in the past 3 years, and he will feel unaccountably shy in your presence." Said Marguerite with a slightly doubtful note. "I hope so." It was on a Sunday that Guardy arrived. The school, in a body, flattened its nose against the window watching his approach. They had rather hoped for a flannel shirt and boots and spurs, and in any case for a sombrero. But the horrible truth must be told. He wore a frock coat of the most unimpeachable cut, with a silk hat and a stick, and a white gardenia in his buttonhole. To look at him, one would swear that he had never seen a pistol or a lariat. He was born to pass the plate in church. But the worst is still to tell. He had planned a surprise for his little ward. When she should come back to the ranch, it would be to a real home. A sweet womanly influence would have transformed it into a fitting abode for a young girl. Guardy was not alone. He was accompanied by his bride, a tall, fair, beautiful woman with a low voice and gracious manners. She sang for the girls after dinner, and as 64 pairs of eyes studied the beautiful presence, 63 of her auditors decided to grow up to be exactly like her. Marguerite did the honors in a state of dazed incomprehension. Her make-believe world of 7 weeks had crumbled in an hour, and she had not had time to readjust herself. Never, she realized it perfectly, could she have competed in femininity with Guardy's wife. It wasn't in her, not even if she had commenced practice from the cradle. They went back to the city in the evening, and before the entire school, Guardy patted her on the head and told her to be a good little kitty and mind her teachers. His wife, with a protecting arm about her shoulders, kissed her forehead and called her dear little daughter. After evensong on Sundays came 2 hours of freedom. The teachers gathered in the dowager's study for coffee and conversation, and the girls presumably wrote letters home. But that night the south corridor followed no such peaceful occupation. Marguerite McCoy experienced a reversion to type. In her own picturesque language, she shot up the town. The echoes of the orgy at last reached the coffee clatch below. Miss Lord came to investigate, and she came on her tiptoes. Miss McCoy, arrayed in a sometime picture hat cocked over one ear, a short gymnasium skirt, scarlet stockings, and a scarlet sash, was mounted upon a table giving an imitation of a clog dance in a mining camp, while her audience played ragtime on combs and clapped. "Marguerite, get down!" someone suddenly warned in frightened tones above the uproar. "You needn't call me Marguerite. I'm Kid McCoy of Cripple Creek." Her eye caught sight of Miss Lord towering above the heads crowded in the doorway, and she quite suddenly climbed down. For once Miss Lord was without words. She stared for a space of 3 minutes. Finally she managed to articulate, "Sunday evening in a church school." The audience dispersed, and Miss Lord and Miss McCoy remained alone. Rosalie fled to the farthermost reaches of Paradise Alley and discussed possible punishments with Patty and Connie for a trembling hour. Lights out had rung before she summoned courage to steal back to the darkened south corridor. The sound of smothered sobbing came from Marguerite's bed. Rosalie sank down on her knees and put her arm around her roommate. The sobbing ceased while Marguerite rigidly held her breath. "Kid," she comforted, "don't mind Lordy. She's a horrid, snooping old thing. What did she say?" "I'm not to leave Bounds for a month. Have to learn 5 Psalms by heart and take 50 demerits." "50? It's a perfect shame. You'll never work them off. She had no right to make a fuss when you'd been good so long." "I don't care," said Kid fiercely, as she struggled to free herself from Rosalie's embrace. "She'll never have a chance again to call me her sweet little daughter." Chapter 10. Recording by Patty Cunningham.